This is Kim Hammer, pastor of Saline Baptist Church in the community of Tull outside Benton, with your devotion taken from the book of Joshua, chapter 10. The setting is that Gibeon has made peace with the nation of Israel, and as a result of it, the kings that they were once allied with became bitter toward them because they had made peace with God's people. And as a result of it, they came together and they were going to attack Gibeon. There are four things that are noted in chapter 10 about the city of Gibeon that we did not realize before. First of all, the Bible tells us that to that region and to that area, it was an important city. It was a city of prominence. It was a city of prestige. It was kind of like the jewel, if you would, of the area. The second thing it tells us is that it was a royal city. In other words, a lot of royalty lived there, and it was a city that was used to living the good life, as we would say. The third thing is that it was a city that was larger than Ai, and Ai was a population of about 12,000 plus. And then the fourth thing that we notice is that all the men of the city knew how to fight, which is ironic because the city of Gibeon had gone to the nation of Israel and had made peace with them, even though they had a reputation for being good fighters. But you know, when you go up against God, you can be the best fighter, but if you're not on the side of God, you're going to be defeated. And Gibeon realized that after they had seen what Joshua had done to Jericho and to the city of Ai. And so the kings around them became bitter toward them, and they came to defeat them and to punish them. It's interesting sometimes how the enemy turns on its own whenever it is that they don't like what they do among themselves. One of the things we need to realize as God's people is that we don't need to turn on our own, that instead, where we have common cause, we need to stand together in order that we might attack the enemy and in order that we might stand strong against the enemy. Some of the leaders of Gibeon slipped out and got to Joshua and said, "These kings have come up against us to destroy us. We are your servants. We need your protection." There are two things in that thought. Number one, the inhabitants of Gibeon did not go back to their old way or to their old loyalties. Instead, they remained faithful and true to Joshua and looked to him for help. The second thing is Joshua stood true to his oath, and he came to their rescue and he came to their aid. You know, the city of Gibeon did not worship God. They did not have that relationship with the Messiah to come. But yet, at least they were people of integrity that honored their oath and remained loyal to Joshua, even when it would have been easier for them to turn and go back to the old ways. Joshua responded by rallying his men, and they marched all night and came to protect the city of Gibeon. Reminded me of the Battle of the Bulge during World War II, wherever it was that our soldiers rallied to the cause, and they marched all night and they engaged the enemy, and it was a turning point in the war. And so it was for this battle as well. Joshua brought his men through the night, and they engaged the enemy immediately, and God delivered them unto him. Now, it was a strategic move on the part of God because he had hardened the hearts of the king, and he had drew them out of their safety. We find that as they were attacking the city of Gibeon, they were out of their zone, they were out of their element, and they became an easy prey for Joshua and his men to defeat. And it tells us that it slew the majority of them, and there were only a few that made it back to their city, and then never a person spoke a word against the nation of Israel. We need to learn something as God's people out of that. Whenever it is that we need to rise to the occasion, we need to look beyond our own human strength and look to the spiritual strength that God will give us in order to rise up against the enemy and surprise them by doing what they wouldn't expect us to do something that is uncharacteristic. And if ever there was a time for God's people to rise up and do something out of the ordinary, to do something that is uncharacteristic to where we are today, it's now. That we rise up and surprise our enemy, meet them on an area where they are not familiar, and allow God to defeat them through what he will use us as his vessels to do. Joshua goes back, and one thing I do want to notice also is that God showed himself out because he allowed the sun to stand still for a full day, which gave Joshua and his men the ability to fight them in the daylight, and they didn't have to go into nighttime warfare. God showed out that day, and that he delivered the enemy to God's people. Joshua brings those 5 kings before him. He called his commanders, and they put their feet on their neck, which was an act of submission and an act of defeat and an act of finality for those kings, and then they slew them and removed them from their presence. One of the things we need to realize out of all this is that when we as God's people rise to the occasion and we trust God to give us the strength that otherwise we might not normally have, God will deliver the victory once we show to God that we are going to be people of our word, and we are going to make ourselves submissive to him and let him work through us.